Season 5 of Deep Rock Galactic delivered a lot of banger overclocks. Mortar rounds, pump action, and crystal nucleation to name a few. But one overclock really stood out to me, and that is Marked for Death. This overclock allows your focus shots to charge faster and inflict a vulnerability debuff for a limited duration. This all comes at the expense of a reduced clip size, focus shots costing more ammo, and reducing focus shots to 0 damage. Now I gotta say, I don't like this overclock. I love this overclock. It's a type of modification that I think the Scout has been missing in their arsenal, something that really leans into the support aspect for their primaries. And I know what you're thinking. Support? Pfft, that doesn't sound fun at all. Well, support is not a role that needs to be dull and boring. In fact, it can be the exact opposite. If anything, this build is quite flexible in bringing offense and support when needed, embracing the role of assassin and spotter, bringing swift death to your enemies and protection to your allies. So let's see how we can get the most out of this overclock so you too could take down some of the worst Hoxies has to offer. Let's start with your basic equipment. For mods on the M1000, we're going with 1-2-2-1-1. We're taking more ammo for more focus shots, reduced recoil for better hipfire accuracy, increased clip size to counteract the overclock penalty, plus 3 penetration to shoot through multiple armored targets, and a guaranteed 3-second stun on focus shots for our tier 5 mod. These are my personal preferences, but the best thing about this setup is that it's flexible for your own playstyle, so feel free to change your tier 2, 4, and 5 mods respectively. When it comes to your secondaries, any of them compare well with this setup. That being said, I find the boomstick and crossbow pair exceptionally well. You typically want a secondary that either hits hard or offers good crowd control. Boomstick with double barrel is the best of both worlds, offering fantastic crowd control and reliable close range damage, giving you full range coverage with the M1000. It also makes for good follow-up damage after marking targets. If you don't have double barrel, Shape Shells makes for a decent substitute if you want to stay at range but not compromise on single target damage. If you bring a crossbow, Bodkin Bolts offers solid crowd control, especially with pheromone or taser bolts. Or if you want single target focus, bring Trifork Volley to really lay into those bigger targets. As for grenades, you can slot in whatever you think your build is missing. The Stun Sweeper is a good all-round grenade, able to dish out equal parts damage and stuns. Pheromones offer superb crowd control effects in dealing with hordes. And finally, IFG and cryo grenades can slow their targets, hindering not just their speed, but also adding even more damage vulnerability to the mix, with freeze and the inhibitor field. On first glance, this overclock seems counterintuitive for something like Hoxies. However, in practice, it makes an offensive support playstyle not just viable, but also highly effective at keeping your team ahead of the game. The core strength of this entire overclock is its ability to delete bulky or disruptive enemies. You know them as Praetorians, Bombers, Stingtails, and Menaces, among other names. What makes these enemies dangerous is not just their high HP, but their ability to sabotage team cohesion. We've all been subject to being flung around by oppressors, pulled by Stingtails, and bowled over by Shellbacks. The longer these types of enemies remain on the field, the greater their chances to wreak havoc. Marked for Death, however, is able to keep these enemies in check by making them severely vulnerable to all sources of damage, and expedites the kill time for most special enemies. This is why I recommended the stun effect for the tier 5 mod on the M1000, which is an added guaranteed effect for your charge shots that very few enemies can outright resist. A well-timed combination of stun and debuff can allow your teammates to easily shred through high-value targets before they have a chance to react. The power this overclock provides is akin to the same effect that the Gunner's Shield provides, the ability to tip fights back in your team's favor. Being able to rapidly halt and dispatch these types of enemies prevents them from snowballing into bigger threats, and most importantly, allows your team to redirect their focus to more pressing objectives. Another takeaway from this overclock is that it rewards a bird's eye playstyle. As a scout, your priorities are exploration and mining. Marked for Death adds spotter to that list. While exploring and gathering minerals, you want to constantly scan the area as your team progresses further into the caves. Now, any member can do this, but you are in a literal position to do this more effectively. As a scout, you have the fastest traversal tool and access to some of the best vantage points, allowing you to see exactly where enemies are and what directions they are coming from. Having this kind of tactical information allows you to relay this to your team and can help you make better decisions on whether to take a more offensive or supportive stance when aiding your teammates. Now, this build does come with its fair share of flaws. For starters, it's not solo friendly. It requires you to stay in closer proximity than usual when doing your class tasks. This doesn't mean you can never venture out on your own. However, you shouldn't stay away from your team for extended periods of time. The damage bonus from Marked for Death is effective for yourself, but it becomes more efficient to use when there are other teammates around to contribute damage. Marks don't offer much support if you're the only one benefiting from them. Crowds or groups of enemies is another thing this build can struggle with. This is a drawback to the M1000 in general, and this overclock highlights that weakness even further. As I mentioned previously, bringing certain secondaries and grenades can help offset this weakness. That being said, if you are lacking in crowd control, you will need to rely on your teammates to help deal with swarms, while you focus on marking disruptive enemies. Speaking of which, the final drawback to this build is that it requires good ammo discipline. You have to know how to pick and choose your targets. This is also something you need to learn with the M1000 that this overclock really puts to the test. The higher focus shot cost means we don't want to be marking every single target and wasting ammo. Same thing goes for our regular shots. Even with no damage, the M1000's base damage can reliably take out weaker enemies. That being said, it is important to have good discretion on knowing what targets you should engage, and targets you are better off letting your teammates handle. Marked for Death is one of the more underrated overclocks from Season 5. It offers a playstyle that definitely takes some getting used to and will put your know-how of the M1000 to the test. What it gives in return, however, is arguably some of the best crowd control the Scout can offer during missions. The ability to completely shut down some of the most dangerous enemies in the caves. Sometimes, the best crowd control is simply getting rid of the enemies before they are even a threat. While it encourages a more limited playstyle, there's a lot of flexibility in terms of the gear you can bring in determining whether you want to embrace a more offensive role, supportive role, or a mix of both. I highly recommend you give this overclock a spin if you want to embrace a more tactical and supportive role during missions, or just enjoy seeing big enemies cut down to size.